What if the most terrifying moment of your life was not caused by an enemy, but by God himself? Imagine this. A man is walking through the desert at night. The wind is quiet. The stars are watching. And this man carries the most important mission in history. God himself had spoken to him. God had chosen him to confront the most powerful king on earth. God had promised that through him, an entire nation would be freed from slavery. His name was Moses. Everything about his journey looked like destiny. God had appeared to him in a burning bush. God had given him miracles. God had promised to go with him. But then something happened that almost no one talks about. One night, while Moses was traveling with his family, the Bible says something shocking. God met him on the road and tried to kill him. Yes, the very God who had just chosen Moses now stood against him. There was no warning, no thunder, no explanation, just sudden danger in the darkness. Something was terribly wrong. Moses, the chosen leader of Israel, was suddenly fighting for his life. And the person who saved him was not an angel. It was his wife, Zipporah. In a moment of desperation, she performed one of the strangest acts recorded in the Bible. A mysterious ritual, a desperate decision. And instantly, the danger stopped. God withdrew. Moses lived. But the question remains. Why would God try to kill the very man he had just chosen? What secret had Moses ignored? What command had he failed to obey? And why does this short, mysterious moment in the book of Exodus reveal a terrifying truth about obedience to God? Tonight, we uncover the hidden meaning behind one of the most disturbing stories in Scripture. Because sometimes, the greatest danger in your life is not the enemy you see. It is the command of God you quietly ignored. Long before that terrifying night on the road, the story of Moses had already been filled with fear, failure, and running away. Moses was not born a hero. He was born during a time of terror. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. Their cries filled the land. They built cities, carried stones, and lived under the harsh command of the most powerful empire on earth. The king of Egypt, known as Pharaoh, feared that the Hebrew people were growing too strong. So he made a cruel decree. Every Hebrew baby boy must die. It was a command meant to erase a nation before it could rise. But one mother refused to surrender her child. She hid her baby for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a small basket and set him among the reeds of the Nile River. The child drifted into the hands of destiny. The daughter of Pharaoh discovered the basket. She heard the baby crying and felt compassion. Instead of death, the child received a palace. The slave child was raised as a prince. That child was Moses. He grew up surrounded by power, wealth, and the wisdom of Egypt. He learned the language of kings. He walked the halls of the palace. From the outside, his life looked perfect. But deep inside, Moses knew the truth. He was not Egyptian. He was Hebrew. And one day, everything changed. Moses walked out of the palace and saw an Egyptian soldier beating a Hebrew slave. The anger inside him exploded. Looking around to see if anyone was watching, Moses struck the Egyptian and killed him. For a moment, he thought no one knew. But the next day, 2 Hebrew men were arguing. When Moses tried to stop them, one of them looked at him and said something that froze his blood. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" In that moment, Moses realized the truth. His secret was no longer a secret. Word spread quickly. Soon Pharaoh heard what had happened. The prince of Egypt had committed murder, and Pharaoh wanted him dead. The man raised in the palace became a fugitive overnight. Moses ran. He ran across the desert, far from Egypt, far from power, far from the life he once knew. Eventually, he arrived in a distant land called Midian, where no one knew his past. There, Moses disappeared from history. The man who once walked in royal courts became a shepherd. Day after day, he wandered through quiet deserts, guiding sheep through dry valleys and lonely mountains. Years passed, then decades. 40 years slipped away in silence. Perhaps Moses believed his story was over. But God had not forgotten him. One day, while Moses was leading his flock near a mountain called Mount Horeb, something strange caught his eye. A bush was burning. That alone was not unusual in the desert. But this fire was different. The bush burned, yet it was not consumed. The flames danced on the branches, but the leaves remained alive. Curious, Moses stepped closer, and then a voice called from the fire. "Moses, Moses." The man who had once been a prince fell silent. "Here I am," he answered. The voice continued, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground." In that moment, Moses realized who was speaking. It was God. God had seen the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. He had heard their cries, and now he had chosen a man to confront Pharaoh and lead his people out of slavery. That man was Moses. But Moses was terrified. Instead of accepting the mission, he began to argue. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? What if the people don't believe me? What if they ask who sent me?" God answered every question. "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." Still Moses resisted. "What if they don't listen to me?" God showed him miracles. His staff turned into a serpent. His hand became diseased and then healed again. Even water from the Nile could become blood. Yet Moses still hesitated. Finally, he spoke the words that revealed his deepest fear. "Please, Lord, send someone else." For a moment, the Bible says something rare. The anger of God burned against Moses. Yet even then, God showed mercy. He allowed Moses' brother Aaron to help him speak. The mission was set. The reluctant shepherd would return to Egypt. The runaway prince would stand before Pharaoh. And through him, God would shake the greatest empire on earth. Moses returned home and told his father-in-law he must go back to Egypt. He gathered his wife Zipporah and their children. Together they began the long journey across the desert. Everything seemed to be moving according to God's plan. The calling had been given. The mission had begun. The chosen deliverer was finally walking toward destiny. But there was one problem, a command from God that Moses had quietly ignored. And because of that hidden disobedience, the man chosen to save a nation was about to face death before he even reached Egypt. The journey back to Egypt should have been the beginning of history. For the first time in 40 years, Moses was no longer hiding in the desert. He was walking toward the destiny God had prepared for him. Behind him were the quiet hills of Midian. Ahead of him stood the greatest empire on earth, Egypt, the land where he had once been a prince, the land where he had once been a murderer, and the land where millions of Israelites still lived in chains. But now Moses carried something more powerful than royal blood. He carried the command of God. The God who had spoken from the burning bush had not only given Moses a mission, he had given him authority. God had said something astonishing. "You will perform signs before Pharaoh. You will confront the king of Egypt. And through you, I will bring my people out." For a man who had spent 40 years hiding among sheep, it was almost unimaginable. Moses had doubted himself again and again. Yet somehow the journey had begun. His wife Zipporah traveled with him, along with their sons. They moved slowly through the desert paths, carrying supplies, resting when night fell, rising again when the sun returned. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary journey. But spiritually, this was one of the most important missions in human history. Because God was about to confront the ruler of Egypt, the mighty Pharaoh, and Moses was the messenger. Yet hidden inside this story was a problem, something small, something quiet, something easy to overlook. But in the eyes of God, it was not small. Years earlier, God had made a covenant with a man named Abraham. This covenant was not just a promise. It was a sacred relationship between God and Abraham's descendants. God promised Abraham land, blessing, and a future nation. In return, the people of that covenant would carry a physical sign. That sign was circumcision. Every male child born into the covenant family was to be circumcised on the 8th day. It was not merely a cultural tradition. It was a mark of belonging, a sign that this child was part of God's chosen people. For generations, this command had been passed down. It was sacred. It was serious. And God had once said something very direct about it. Any male who refused this sign of the covenant would be cut off from the people. This command was recorded long before Moses was born. Yet somehow, somewhere, something had gone wrong. Because Moses had sons, and at least one of them had not been circumcised. Why? The Bible does not explain fully, but many scholars believe the reason may have involved his life in Midian. Zipporah was not an Israelite by birth. She came from a Midianite family, a different culture with different traditions. It is possible that circumcision was not practiced the same way among her people. Perhaps Moses delayed the command. Perhaps he avoided conflict in his marriage. Perhaps after 40 years in the desert, he slowly became less strict about the traditions of his ancestors. Whatever the reason, the command of God had been neglected. And now Moses was carrying a dangerous contradiction. He was on his way to demand obedience from Pharaoh, while secretly ignoring obedience himself. God had chosen him to lead a covenant people, while his own household had not fully honored the covenant. From a human perspective, it might seem like a small issue. After all, Moses had just spoken to God. He had seen miracles. He had accepted a mission to free an entire nation. Surely something like this could wait. But God does not measure obedience the way humans do. To God, obedience is not measured by how big the mission is. It is measured by whether the command is followed. And sometimes the smallest disobedience becomes the most dangerous. The journey continued. The desert sun slowly dropped behind the mountains. Shadows stretched across the land. Eventually, Moses and his family stopped for the night at a small lodging place along the road. It was an ordinary stop, just another quiet evening on the path to Egypt. No one expected anything unusual. There were no armies, no storms, no enemies waiting in the darkness. Yet this peaceful night was about to become one of the strangest and most frightening moments in the entire Bible. Because while Moses slept, God was coming, not with guidance, not with comfort, but with judgment. The man chosen to rescue Israel was about to discover something terrifying. God does not ignore disobedience, even in the lives of the people he calls. And the night that followed would prove a truth many people still struggle to accept. Being chosen by God does not protect you from his discipline. Sometimes it makes it unavoidable. And before Moses could ever stand before Pharaoh, before the plagues, before the Red Sea, he would face something far more personal, a confrontation between God and the man he had chosen. And by the time the night was over, one desperate act from an unexpected person would determine whether Moses lived or died. Night fell over the desert like a heavy curtain. The long road toward Egypt had finally paused. After hours of travel through dry valleys and rocky paths, Moses and his family stopped at a small lodging place along the road. It was nothing impressive, just a temporary shelter where travelers could rest before continuing their journey. The air was cool, the desert quiet. The mission to Egypt had begun. Somewhere beyond the horizon stood the kingdom Moses once fled, the land ruled by Pharaoh, the ruler who believed himself to be a living God. Soon Moses would stand before that king. Soon he would demand freedom for the enslaved Israelites. Soon the greatest confrontation between heaven and empire would begin. But that night, none of that happened. Instead, something far more mysterious occurred. Something so strange that the Bible records it in only a few short lines. Yet those lines carry a terrifying weight. The book of Exodus simply says, "At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to kill him." No explanation, no warning, just a sudden encounter between God and Moses. Imagine the scene. The night is silent. The desert wind whispers across the sand. Inside the shelter, Moses rests after a long day of travel. His wife Zipporah and their children are nearby. Everything feels normal. Then suddenly something changes. Perhaps Moses feels it first. A heaviness in the air. A presence in the darkness. Something powerful. Something terrifying. And in that moment Moses realizes a shocking truth. God is here, but not the way he experienced him at the burning bush. This time the presence is not warm or inviting. It is dangerous. The same God who had called him now stood against him. The Bible does not describe exactly what happened physically. Some believe Moses suddenly fell sick or was struck with a supernatural affliction. Others believe a visible angel of judgment appeared. But one thing is clear. Moses was in immediate danger of dying. The mission to Egypt had not even begun. Yet the man chosen to lead Israel was now facing death from the very God who had chosen him. Why? Because God had not forgotten the command Moses ignored. The covenant sign given to Abraham had been neglected in Moses' own household. The deliverer of Israel had allowed disobedience inside his own family. And now the seriousness of that decision was being revealed. Inside the shelter, panic must have spread quickly. Moses, the strong leader who would soon confront Pharaoh, was suddenly helpless. Something invisible was closing in. Something divine. Something unstoppable. And then someone else understood what was happening. Zipporah. The Bible does not tell us exactly how she realized the problem. Perhaps Moses himself cried out the reason. Perhaps she had known about the command all along. But in that terrifying moment, she understood the truth. God was enforcing his covenant. And the only way to stop the judgment was obedience. Immediately, Zipporah acted. She grabbed a sharp stone. There was no time to hesitate. No time to argue. The danger was too close. Using the stone, she circumcised their son according to the command God had given generations earlier. It was a shocking and desperate act. Blood fell, and then she did something even more unusual. Zipporah touched the blood to Moses and cried out words that sound strange to modern readers. "You are surely a bridegroom of blood to me." Her words expressed frustration, anger, and urgency all at once. The situation was terrifying and painful. Yet in that moment, obedience mattered more than comfort. And as soon as the command was fulfilled, everything changed. The danger disappeared. The presence that threatened Moses withdrew. The judgment stopped. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter was over. The Bible records the result in a single simple statement. So the Lord let him alone. Moses lived. The man chosen to confront Pharaoh had almost died before even reaching Egypt. Not because he lacked faith, not because he lacked courage, but because he had ignored a command that God considered sacred. That night left a permanent mark on Moses' story. Before he could challenge the ruler of Egypt, before he could perform miracles, before he could lead a nation through the sea, he had to learn a lesson that many people still struggle to understand. God's calling does not cancel God's commands. Being chosen by God does not give permission to ignore him. In fact, the closer a person walks with God, the more seriously God treats their obedience. Moses survived that night, but the memory of what happened would stay with him forever, because he had seen something terrifying. He had learned that God is not only powerful enough to destroy empires, he is also holy enough to confront the disobedience of the very people he calls. And if Zipporah had hesitated for even a moment, the greatest leader in Israel's history might have died in the desert, long before ever reaching Egypt. The danger passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The presence of judgment lifted, and Moses was spared. But the silence that followed must have felt heavy. Moments earlier, the man chosen by God to confront Pharaoh had been on the edge of death, not because of an enemy, not because of a mistaken battle, but because of a command from God that had been ignored. The desert night slowly returned to normal. The wind moved again across the sand. The stars remained in the sky as if nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed, because that moment revealed something many people misunderstand about God. God had called Moses. God had chosen him to rescue Israel. God had given him miracles and authority. But none of that canceled the importance of obedience. In fact, the opposite was true. The closer someone walks with God, the more serious obedience becomes. This is what makes the story so powerful. From a human perspective, Moses had already proven his loyalty. He left the safety of Midian. He accepted a mission that terrified him. He was walking toward Egypt knowing he might face death. Most people would say that level of commitment should be enough. But God does not measure obedience by human standards. God measures obedience by whether his word is followed. And in this case, there was one command that Moses had delayed. The covenant sign given long ago to Abraham had been neglected inside Moses' own family. To understand why this mattered so much, we must remember what the covenant represented. When God made his promise to Abraham, he did not simply give blessings. He created a relationship, a sacred agreement between God and a people. Circumcision became the visible sign of that relationship. It was not about tradition or culture. It was about belonging. It marked someone as part of the people God had chosen. Generation after generation carried that sign as a reminder that they were connected to God's promise. So when Moses failed to apply that sign to his own son, it created a contradiction. The man sent to lead God's covenant people had not fully honored the covenant in his own house. This is why the moment in the desert was so serious. Imagine if Moses had continued to Egypt without correcting this. He would stand before Pharaoh and declare the authority of God. He would demand obedience from the Israelites. He would establish laws and commands. Yet inside his own family, he had ignored one of the oldest commands God had given. That kind of contradiction destroys leadership. Before Moses could call an entire nation to obey God, he had to demonstrate obedience himself. And the person who understood this truth first was not Moses. It was his wife, Zipporah. Her reaction was emotional and intense. The words she shouted, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me," sound harsh. They reflect the shock and frustration of the moment. Zipporah likely felt anger, fear, and confusion all at once. But her actions revealed something powerful. In the moment of crisis, she chose obedience. She did not wait for a better time. She did not debate the command. She acted immediately, and her decision saved Moses' life. This moment also reveals something deeper about God's character. Many people imagine God as patient to the point of ignoring disobedience. But the Bible repeatedly shows something different. God is patient, but he is also holy. Holiness means that God's standards do not bend easily. When God gives a command, he expects it to be taken seriously, especially by the people he calls into leadership. Moses was not just any traveler on the road. He was about to become the leader of Israel. Within a short time, he would stand before Pharaoh, witness plagues that shook Egypt, and guide the Israelites out of slavery. He would climb Mount Sinai and receive the law of God. He would lead the people through the wilderness for 40 years. He would become one of the greatest spiritual leaders in history. But before any of that could happen, God made something clear. Leadership begins with personal obedience. A leader who ignores God's commands cannot guide others toward faithfulness. That is why the moment on the road was necessary. It was not simply punishment. It was correction. God was preparing Moses for the responsibility ahead. Because if Moses could ignore one command now, he might ignore greater commands later. And if a leader does that, the consequences spread to everyone who follows them. The desert night forced Moses to confront a truth that every spiritual leader eventually learns. God does not allow his mission to be carried out through careless obedience. The people God chooses must also choose him. And from that moment forward, Moses understood something he would never forget. The God who performs miracles, the God who defeats empires, the God who speaks through fire and thunder, is also the God who watches the smallest details of obedience. And if Moses was going to lead Israel out of Egypt, he first had to learn that obedience begins at home. The night of danger was over. The desert returned to silence, and Moses continued his journey toward Egypt. But something inside him had changed forever. Before that night, Moses understood God's power. After that night, he understood God's holiness. There is a difference. Power can create miracles. Holiness demands obedience. And Moses had just experienced both. The man who once argued with God at the burning bush was no longer the same hesitant shepherd. The terrifying moment in the desert had burned a lesson into his memory. God's calling is not a reward. It is a responsibility. Soon Moses would stand before Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, the king who believed himself to be divine. Imagine the contrast. On one side stood Pharaoh, surrounded by armies, temples, and wealth. His word controlled one of the most powerful empires in the world. On the other side stood Moses, a former prince who had spent 40 years as a shepherd. Yet Moses carried something Pharaoh did not: the authority of God. But authority without obedience is dangerous. If Moses himself ignored God's commands, how could he expect the Israelites to obey them later? Because the mission ahead was not simply about escaping slavery. It was about forming a nation that would live according to God's law. Soon the Israelites would gather at Mount Sinai. There, God would reveal commandments that shaped moral life for generations. Commandments about justice. Commandments about worship. Commandments about honoring God above all other powers. Moses would become the mediator of that law, the man who carried God's word to an entire nation. But imagine the disaster if Moses himself had treated God's commands casually. A leader who bends the rules quietly creates a culture where everyone else does the same. God was preventing that future before it even began. The night of confrontation in the desert was not the end of Moses' mission. It was the beginning of his transformation. Because leadership in God's kingdom works differently from leadership in human kingdoms. Pharaoh ruled through fear and power. God's leaders must rule through obedience. Pharaoh demanded that others serve him. God demanded that Moses first serve him. And the lesson was clear. Before you confront the world's greatest king, you must first submit to heaven's king. Moses continued traveling with a new seriousness. Every command now mattered. Every word from God carried weight. Soon he would arrive near Egypt, where he would meet his brother Aaron, the man God had chosen to help him speak. Together they would walk into Pharaoh's court. Together they would declare a message that would shake the empire. Let my people go. But the courage required for that moment did not come only from miracles. It came from the understanding Moses had gained on that lonely night. He had learned something that many leaders never fully understand. God's mission cannot be carried by someone who treats obedience lightly. The man who will challenge kings must first obey God completely. And because Moses learned that lesson in the desert, he was ready for what came next. Soon Egypt would witness signs and plagues that no empire could resist. Soon the Red Sea would open. Soon a nation would walk out of slavery. But before any of that history unfolded, God ensured that his chosen leader understood the most important truth of all. Miracles may change the world, but obedience changes the man who carries the miracle.
At first glance, the story feels confusing. Why would God call Moses, give him a mission to save Israel, and then suddenly confront him on the road as if he were an enemy? To many readers, it almost feels unfair. But the deeper you look, the clearer the lesson becomes. This moment was never about destroying Moses. It was about preparing him. Because God was not just choosing a messenger. He was shaping a leader. Within a short time, Moses would stand before Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. He would challenge the authority of an empire and demand the freedom of millions. He would eventually stand on Mount Sinai and deliver the law that would guide an entire nation. But leadership in God's kingdom begins with something simple. Obedience. Not public obedience. Private obedience. The kind that happens when no one is watching. Moses had accepted the calling of God. But inside his own household, one command had been ignored. And before Moses could guide Israel toward faithfulness, God required him to correct that contradiction. The lesson is simple, yet powerful. God does not separate the public mission from the private life. What happens in private matters? A leader cannot ask others to obey God while quietly ignoring his commands. This story also reveals another surprising truth. The person who saved Moses that night was not a prophet, not an angel, not a miracle. It was his wife, Zipporah. Her quick decision in a moment of crisis changed the course of history. If she had hesitated, if she had delayed obedience, the man chosen to lead Israel out of slavery might have died in the desert before ever reaching Egypt. History itself could have changed. And that is why this short, mysterious moment in the book of Exodus carries such a powerful message. God's plans are great. God's promises are powerful. But his commands are never optional. Many people want God's calling. Many people want God's blessings. But far fewer people understand the seriousness of obedience. The story of Moses on that dark desert night reminds us of something many modern believers forget. God is loving. God is patient. But God is also holy. And holiness means that his word matters. Even when it feels small. Even when it feels inconvenient. Even when no one else notices. Because sometimes the greatest turning points in history are not the famous miracles everyone sees. Sometimes they happen quietly. In the darkness. On an ordinary road. When someone finally chooses to obey God completely.